My father recently told me that the worst thing his parents ever did was to move out of the family holler in the hills of East Tennessee and into the big city of Nashville. But in 1949, that is exactly what happened. He was 4 years old, and his entire world had been turned upside down overnight. Now strangers brought the milk. Strangers sold the meat and vegetables. Strangers lived next door in houses that were too close, on top of yards that were too small. His animals were gone. His friends and cousins were gone. Self-sustaining no longer, his family had become caught up in a web of finance stretching around the globe and back. The same sticky strands most of us are caught in still today. They had a small garden, and grandmother's canned sweet pickles were the best around, but deep roots had been severed, and life was never the same. In countless similar stories, extended families are separated from one another, just as man is separated from the land that sustains him. Cut off from nature and made to live on top of the green world rather than alongside it, man often creates a society in which roots are shallow and man is all too easily plucked up and tossed aside, even made to declare war on nature herself. My father never did, and he has lamented that separation from the family land his entire life. Sadly, he is not alone. Far too many long for a way of life now lost, that simple, hewn from the land, non-acquisitive but fierce independence, so often burned away in the financial aftermath of war. In fact, it was the second war to end all wars that weakened grandfather's resolve and the rural economy. 70 years earlier, his great-grandfather had dealt with the aftermath of yet another war, hell-bent on destroying anything traditional, familial, agrarian, and independent. Brownlow, a Yankee Reconstructionist and one whom we might today call a progressive liberal, was made governor of Tennessee just after the war between the states, and he ordered not only law enforcement, but fellow Tennesseans to hunt down any returning rebel soldiers and welcome them back with a sound beating or a noose. Return to the land, your family's land? Never. Such a homecoming was tantamount to a return to rebellion against the rapidly growing federal government, and that was quite simply unacceptable. And so the war continued in the Old South long after peace had been formally declared. Quietly but persistently, the so-called Civil War raged on below Mason's and Dixon's line for many years after the official treaties had been signed. Aside from rooting out and punishing war-weary Johnny Rebs, a way of life more in tune with nature came under fire. Machine waged war on man. Factory waged war on farm. Urban waged war on rural. Technology waged war on tradition. Today the fires of war burn still, and the stakes are as high as ever. Will we become nature's ally or her unwanted master? Will we become self-reliant or dependent on strangers? Will our roots be allowed to run deep, or will we help the acts of so-called progress chop us all down to size? The axe is raised, and it is time we faced an unpleasant truth. The Civil War was not about ending one people's slavery. Rather, it was one giant leap in the long journey to enslave us all. Those who forged the shackles are the same who grease the wheels of international finance with our sweat, blood, tears, and years. Indeed, modern life as we know it is largely a life of slavery. The chains may be invisible, but they bind us just the same, tied like dead weight to our every thought and deed. Like the chattel slave on the plantation, the modern man, the wage slave, owns nothing. He is no one and means nothing to the banker who owns him. He has a tax identification number and a social security number. He is not his name. He is rootless, unattached, and eternally on the move. He is the proverbial everyman, interchangeable with his neighbors whom he does not know, and all of this by deliberate design. In our modern entertainment, media, and education, the tiller of the soil beneath his feet is looked down upon as backward, or maybe just foolish and stubborn. From the family farmer who refuses to sell or industrialize to the Appalachian picker who refuses to leave the holler and home where he was born, the modern man educated in the banker school sees naught but contempt and scorn in those rolling hills and verdant valleys, tinged perhaps with a touch of condescending pity for those who inhabit them. The alleged country bumpkin who refuses to join the industrial system is backward indeed to the progressive modern man who only looks forward, like some weathered beast of burden wearing blinders lest he look to the side and throw off his harness an unseen master. What the modern man does not understand is this. When the farmer and the hillbilly look backward, they see the future, for these are men in tune with nature's repeating cycles, and rural time travels in circles, not lines. Lines reside in the harsh angles of the city, where the modern man pretends to be happy. Is he? He will claim to be, even as he claims superiority over the redneck who lives next door to his parents in a house built by his grandparents. This is a man who knows the lay of the land, his land. He explores it, feels it, and respects it. He grows and sustains life from it. His roots run deep under his own calloused feet. Can one explore, feel, and respect an abstract notion like natural resources? Can one grow or sustain life from a line of credit? Can one's roots spread in concrete? No, of course not. Sadly, the modern man does not feel the lack, for he has been dehumanized. He is easy picking for the globalist who would have us all dependent and all the same. The harvesting of man follows fast on the heels of the eradication of his traditions. When tradition goes, so too does memory and the solace of things known. Cultural amnesia sets in, and the past we once held dear is easily replaced with a false narrative, pushing the agenda of those who would erase our borders and our identity. Statues are torn down. Streets are renamed. Textbooks are rewritten. Tradition and memory, of course, are a solace and strength to those who hold them dear. They are also weapons to use against those who would paint our past with an undeserved guilt. They will tell us that the South is a racist stronghold, that the Civil War was about ending slavery, that the old ways had to be modernized. What they do not tell us is that slavery was drawing to a close before the war due to economic prudence as much as any human rights concerns. They do not tell us that the war was about money and control. They do not tell us that the old ways of the Southerners were also the old ways of their European ancestors and an 18th century America now almost forgotten. In short, our false narrative builders do not tell us the truth about our own past. And it is our shared past, whether Billy Yank or Johnny Reb. This is not a divide along Mason's and Dixon's line, but a divide between citizens who are worth a damn and the elite at our banks and capitals who do not give a damn. No, the suited slave traders of Wall Street do not care unless a profit is to be made, and there is far more profit in industry than in small-scale agriculture. Thus farming became an industry, and the family who could not keep up was bought and sold, pushed into the city, and chained to the machine age, all while their children were taught the values of progress and the backwardness and cruelty of their parents and grandparents. It has happened time and again, but never on such a scale as in the aftermath of that supposedly civil war. Entire communities reduced to ash and rubble were swarmed by outsiders who insisted they knew better than anyone born and raised there. The urbanite who represents the powers that wish they be, those same unseen globalist forces pulling government strings today, have long looked down their crooked noses at their cousins from the countryside, clear back to the days of the Roman Empire. The word pagan, for instance, was originally derogatory, meaning a rustic person from the country. Likewise, barbarian is something of an insult, and that barbar was the Roman urbanite's way of ridiculing the language of the people who would eventually storm their gates. Fast forward to the American Revolution, wherein the fledgling United States government was only too happy to accept a fighting hand from her farmers, whom she would in turn and immediately tax more heavily than King George ever dreamed. The Whiskey Rebellion erupted, and the hillbillies with their whiskey stills were crushed by the long arm of Uncle Sam and his taxes, taxes, taxes. The country folk were expected to pay for the recent war, you see, while the suits in D.C. reaped the rewards of newfound power. Little had changed by the time the Civil War erupted. The government threw a war, and the rural folk marched in to fill the front ranks, only to face ridicule and destitution when the cannons were silenced. The South in particular had to be punished for daring to live differently than the modern world prescribed. the rebels had to be re-educated and reprogrammed, or so said men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, both of whom are precursors to the liberal-minded senators in Washington today. Stevens, known as the Dictator, was deeply involved in passing the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which allowed the United States government to print money rather than rely on actual gold or silver, thus paving the way to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the financial slavery of the entire nation. He was also active in promoting the rights of minorities like the Jews, who were largely behind predatory banking reforms. True to his cookie-cutter form, Stevens also pushed for a non-racial definition of American citizenry and universal education, all the while demanding the confiscation of Southern properties. Some sources have him advocating, if necessary, for the extermination of all white Southerners for the benefit of the freed men. His comrade Sumner was cut from the same cloth. He served for a time as chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations, and like Stevens was ruthless in his attitude toward the rebellious South. Foreshadowing the erasure of history rampant today, he proposed that the names of battles from regimental flags be removed. He was too much even for Washington politicians and was censured by the Massachusetts legislature, then relieved of his duties with the Committee on Foreign Relations. He is also recorded as having said that his only regret was that his skin was not black. In both Stevens and Sumner, we have tailored suits parading about our nation's capital, advocating for worthless paper currency, international bankers, minority rights, the dispossession and disenfranchisement of Caucasians, and even their genocide, all the while lamenting their own white skin. The mold had been set, and countless such politicians would be formed by it. Indeed, the whites of the South were to be set upon stools of everlasting repentance, wherein notions like pride of place, uniqueness, and rebellion were smothered in thought's cradle, to be replaced with humility, uniformity, and submission. The shame game continues today, while our history is erased and replaced across the nation and even across the sea, in what Southerners still call the Old Country. Cultural elements from the Old Country were transplanted into the new soil of the Old South as it was settled. These traditions took root and flourished as they mixed with one another, as well as local tribal and African elements, to form new musical and literary genres and a unique outlook on the land and its people. It was all of this and more that was and still is being thrown down the so-called memory hole. Independence, rootedness, and love of the land, these things are not compatible with the modern's agenda, and so these things must be eradicated. The erasers are erasing even as you hear this. The modern's agenda, the root of so many of our woes and the only root that should be willfully severed, is veiled with claims of supporting minority rights, special interest groups for the supposedly downtrodden, equality and tolerance, and all that is used to hide the true agenda, which is cutting us all down to a manageable size for the global plantation and corporate wage slavery. Dependent on paper currency for every need, we must work. Rootless and without pride of place, we will follow the money wherever it takes us. Raceless, sexless, and hopeless, we will be traded like identical stocks and bonds by suited slavers who know our number but not our name. We will become the nameless. Nameless, that is, unless we put down roots and hold tight to our unique identities, whomever we are. This is not a lament for the lost cause of the South. This is an alarm call for anyone, anywhere, whose culture and homeland are threatened. Whether Billy Yank or Johnny Reb, Union Jack or German Jerry, the cannons are aimed at you. Hold tight your unique heritage, make no apologies, and take no prisoners. This is a war on humanity itself, and we are all in it. Dear listener, I charge you to fight however you are able, as if your very survival depends on it, because it does, and do not lower your own unique flag, symbolic or otherwise. It was July 4th, 1865, when a battle-weary flag was lowered for the last time amid tears for the death of a defeated nation. While others in the reunited country celebrated its birth, a group of rebels with long memories held aloft one last time the stars and bars of the Confederacy, only to wrap it around a handful of stones and lower it forever into the Rio Grande. That flag is gone forever, and its replicas are under fire simply for existing. Ours is not the only flag on the chopping block of modernity. Do not let your flag and the unique identity it represents sink forever into the darkness. Fly it. Should one scream offense, fly it higher while you lace your boots and sharpen your blades. The preceding can be found as an article in Europa Sun, issue 6. In closing, I urge you all to read this video's inspiration, a book entitled I'll Take My Stand, The South and the Agrarian Tradition by multiple authors, originally published in 1930. It is readily available for order and is part of the Library of Southern Civilization. Books like this are crucial to understanding why the South refuses to lay to rest the stars and bars of the Confederacy.